during the Q&A session. So if you do need some more specific, or have some more specific questions for Jill about your particular situation, it might be easier to maybe try and make a time with Jill. Because yeah, sometimes it can be hard to answer questions when we don't know the situation very well, and we don't want you guys to have to go into too much detail as well in a public forum. So try and keep your questions more general, but yeah, if you've got something that's fairly straightforward to explain, then yeah, Jill might be able to answer it today for you. So I think we're ready to go, guys. So as I said before, we will be recording the presentation part of this, okay, but we will stop it when we get to the Q&A session, so you guys feel free to, you know, to ask your questions, that sort of thing. We won't be recording it, so it's just for the presentation part of it. And now Jill is here. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. Thank you, and sorry about the little technical issues, but it's really our pleasure to have Jill with us today. She's who I regard to be the expert on parent-child dynamics and parent-child relationships during separation in this country, and well-renowned internationally as well. So it's really great that we have Jill here today to talk about voice, not a choice. It can be a bit of a divisive topic, but it is something that, as a coach myself and for Zane as well, we encounter this a lot. These sorts of issues around parent-child dynamics and voice of child. So welcome, Jill, and again, thank you so much for being with us today. And I will hand it over to you. And yeah, any issues, Zane will be here to help you guys.
Okay. Thank you, David, for such a nice introduction, and kia ora, everybody. I'm not quite sure what the technological glitch was, but thank goodness it had nothing to do with me, because I'm not very good at fixing those sorts of things. So look, with no further ado, we'll get into the presentation, which, as I typically do, I've put together a series of overheads, and I will talk to those. Probably, as David said, it might be best if we save questions for after the presentation. And I don't mind if you want to bring cases into your questions, as long as we talk about them high level, not in lots and lots of detail, because obviously, you know, we don't have the time or the space to do that. But I can usually understand the principles, or I try to anyway, of what's being asked. Okay, so again, welcome to you all, and we'll start the presentation now. So I'm the director of the Family Matters Centre in Auckland, and I do a lot of work, excuse me, with separating families and their children, and I'm very involved in working in child inclusion and child participation, and that's really the topic that we're going to talk about today. We're talking about children having a voice and not a choice, and I hope that will become clearer as we go through the presentation. So just looking at the high-level topics we're going to look at, telling children about separation, ways to support children in discussion, positive impact of the aligned parental approach, in court versus out of court process for views and feelings, and how separation can affect different family members. So we'll go through those topics, but that's just a bit of an overview. So how to talk to children about separation. So children are extremely aware of parental conflict, and conflict doesn't have to mean that parents are arguing intensively with each other. It can also mean that one parent really is resentful and contemptuous of the other parent. So sometimes parents say, look, we'd never argue in front of the children, but children don't actually need to hear arguing, do they, to know that there is a lot of acrimony between their parents. So, as I typically do in my presentations, I refer to Shakespeare and talk about the bard's quotation about grief. Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it break. So that was right back in 1603. And it's no different now. And children who don't get an opportunity, just as adults who don't get an opportunity to talk about what is happening to them, will typically suffer. We know that children suffer ongoing stress when they're not told what's happening and when adults do not take their feelings and views into account. So, in other words, like all of us as adults, we need information to make sense of what is happening in our immediate environments. I'm going to ask you to just give me 1 minute because my computer, whilst I was waiting, has hit a very, very low battery point. If you could bear with me for 2 minutes, I'll just plug it in. Excuse me. Harry, the whole computer's about to die. There's no... No, you do it.
Okay.
I'll just keep talking.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, go ahead. Sure. Sorry.
That's all right.
I'll just put this right here.
Stick that in there.
There you go.
Is it plugged in now?
Yeah.
Right, my apologies. This is a morning of that sort of thing. All right, so just to recap, we know that children struggle without information, and this is where giving children a voice but not a choice starts to make itself manifest in this discussion. So how do we talk to children about what is happening? I'm asked this a lot by families who come to talk to me. You know, how do we tell the children that we are about to separate? So what you'll all have your views on this, and there's no absolute right way or wrong way, but what I tend to suggest is that you explain to children that, you know, mum and dad, so not really, we haven't been happy together as mum and dad, but more as your mum, as your dad, we haven't been making each other very happy and sometimes very unhappy. But here's the really important part, and I often tell parents, of all the reading and writing and thinking about this topic that I've ever done, here's the golden nugget, and that is that mum lets the children know that she is really, really pleased that their dad is their dad. And dad lets the children know he's really pleased they've got mum as their mum. Now, look, this can be really hard when you're not feeling good about the other parent, and indeed when perhaps you feel that other parent's parenting is not good. But, and this is the big but, children don't ask to be born. The children wouldn't be who they were if they weren't half of each of you. And, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But the sense of inherent respect that a child can sense between the parents about the fact that, look, mum and I may not be the best of friends as we were, but I tell you what, she's a pretty good mum and she loves you, and vice versa with dad. So I know this isn't an easy one. Nothing that's really important is ever all that easy. And I quite often have long discussions with each parent about this. But I do, hand on my heart, believe this is really, really important. The other part to talk to children about is the fact that you will be open to talking to the children more about the situation. So if you've just broken it to the children that you are separating, and preferably you talk to them together about it. It doesn't need to be a long, involved conversation. I think just leave the children with the knowledge that you will talk about it some more when they've had time to think more about it and perhaps they've got questions. So how do we support children to discuss how they're feeling if we're looking at children being involved in the dialogue, in the rearrangement, which of course they are? Well, probably another very, very important principle is to understand what we call the loyalty bind, and that is the principal impact that parental conflict has on children. So I've told people before in my presentation, so forgive me if you've heard this before, but I think it's an extremely good metaphor, and that is the little boy I saw when he was 7, who had bad tummy aches, in and out of hospital. When I talked to him, as I do, very, very carefully about how he was feeling, and not what he wanted, but how he was feeling, he said, Daddy says I can choose paint color for my new bedroom at his house. I don't know what to choose because Mummy loves blue and Daddy loves green. That was a very, very salient metaphor that little 7-year-old made. I mean, what 7-year-old do you know who doesn't know what his or her favorite color is? But so powerful is the impact of conflict on the developing brain that this little boy was so preoccupied with having to make choices, and in particular the loyalty bind. I'm damned if I choose green and I'm damned if I choose blue. This really, really impacts the children, and it's this very aspect of children enduring conflict that can go on to make them really quite ill. So just looking at attachment styles, which I'm sure everybody listening to this presentation will be aware of. So attachment is the glue, isn't it, that's got us through evolution. We attach, and children will naturally attach to their primary caregivers, who are often mum and dad, not always, but whoever the primary caregivers are, they will attach. And it's very difficult, in fact, very hazardous to detach. So what we get when there are wobbly attachment styles, we get anxious attachments, and you know, these attachment styles follow us through to adulthood. And look, all of us have various issues with attachment, but it's when we come across these really deep attachment styles that we know they've often got their roots in childhood. So the anxious attacher, I want to be extremely emotionally close with the other parent, the other person that I'm relating to. This might be in adulthood, but they might abandon me. The fearful avoidant attacher, I have trust issues and I maintain distance from others. The avoidant, it's very important I feel independent and self-sufficient, so I'm not going to let my guard down, and I'm going to be very careful about attachment. And then, of course, the ideal, which is the secure attacher. I don't worry about being abandoned or about someone getting too close to me. Now, life is never perfect. People experience different losses and broken attachments. But to raise the healthy child, albeit a child whose parents are separating, we really need to keep an eye on these attachment styles. So when I work with children, I tend to really emphasize that point I was making a few minutes ago, which is about acknowledging in a very positive way their mum and their dad. And so this is just an idea of some books that some of you watching this presentation might like to get hold of, because sometimes just talking to children can be less effective than actually doing a little bit of reading with a book that's age appropriate. And these books mostly span the primary intermediate school age. So My Dad, which is a sweet one, Two Homes, which speaks for itself. Was It the Chocolate Pudding, which is about two little children who wondered if their parents had separated because they'd had a fight because the children had had a fight about the chocolate pudding. And the other one, My Mum's the best mum. Sometimes parents say to me, we've spoken to the children and we've made it really clear to them that we love them and it's nothing they ever did that's caused us to separate, which I guess is what the Was It the Chocolate Pudding is all about. What I tend to find is mostly children do feel very loved by both their parents. So they don't really tend to think it was something that they did. It's good to reassure them that it wasn't. But mostly children whose parents are concerned enough to come and talk to me about the situation are very, very loved by their parents. What the children can't cope with, as I keep emphasizing, is one parent pitting themselves against the other parent. That just does not work for children. So what is the positive impact, to look at this in reverse then, or the other side of it, the positive impact of the aligned parental approach? So when I'm talking about the aligned parental approach, I'm talking about mum and dad coming from the same position. Now, this is hard when you are dealing with adult issues. But again, it comes back to the fact that children do better when they know that regardless of differences, which the children don't actually particularly want to know about, that mum and dad are coming from we. Mum and I feel that. Dad and I have discussed this, and we. If you can remember to use those words, you will be helping your child enormously. And I often say to people, for those of you who've ever been to London in the Underground, there's that voice that comes on, mind the gap between the platform and the train. And in fact, that's how it is for children. Mind the gap, because children will just be drawn like moths to a flame when they perceive there's a gap between their parents. And it's not because children are naughty, they are just driven to somehow manipulate that gap, not to their own gains, but there's something about a gap in the parental alignment which makes children very disturbed and unhappy. And they will either, like the little boy with the blue and green room, become quite disturbed and often unwell, or they might start acting out, or they might be really naughty when they're with mum or with dad. They might tell tales on mum or dad. And you know, sometimes parents will say to me, Johnny said that you just left him in the car, or you let him stay up all night watching R-rated movies. And the other parent will say, I didn't. And the other parent will say, well, that's what he told me. Now, sometimes children will plumb and manipulate that gap. And in some way, you can read that as an attempt to almost shock the parents to getting back into alignment. Now, we don't actually know, because children can't really explain that very well. And that's one of the skills and features of knowing how to interview children very carefully in these family dispute resolution or any situation in family law where children are being interviewed, to understand the impact of the need that the child has to maintain attachment to both their parents. So a long time ago, awfully long time ago, I wrote a research study called Hello, I'm a Voice, Let Me Talk. And again, forgive me if you have sat in presentations before where I've talked about it. It still remains the only piece of published research in New Zealand on this topic. And so it's wide open for people who want to update it, but the principles to me stay the same. I interviewed 17 families and 26 children from those families, aged between 6 and 18. And in those days, we had something called family court counselling, where the public got 6 hours of government-funded work to help them with separation. Sadly, we don't have that anymore, but that was what the research was based on. So what did I find? Well, the findings from the children in this qualitative study were they felt satisfied at being heard within the family. So one boy of 14 said to me, "It's absolutely stink talking to a stranger. It's like shame. Jill already knew my family story." And so part of my research was why I have always found it effective to work with the parents and the children myself, because the children don't feel like they're telling tales out of school when they come to talk to me, because I can say, "You know what, I've met your mum and your dad, and I've heard so much about you. I almost feel like I already know you, and it's so nice to meet you." And that takes away the stress that children naturally feel about talking to strangers, because actually children are very loyal and they don't really want to tell stories outside family to someone they don't know. The other major finding was that children experienced a lowering of anxiety over practical issues. There's one little girl of 11 said, "I liked that mum and dad understood I wanted to see them equally." Other children will say things like, "I'm so glad that daddy now understands that I want to see Nan on Christmas Day." Just many practical things, which sometimes as adults, when we're so caught up with all the big things that are happening in separation, we don't realize that our children are really, really worrying about, where's the dog going to be if we're away with mum and dad's gone to Australia. There are just many things that bother children that sometimes the rearranging family can be supported to work out once somebody can find out what's happening for the child. And the thing about children is I see them as little foot soldiers often, and they're so brave, actually. And they will say to me, "I don't want to talk about it because mum and dad are already upset and angry, and I don't want them to have more problems to deal with." And these are the issues that can really gnaw away at children's equanimity at a time of enormous transition. So we know from research that children tell researchers like me and many, many others in the field that they want to be consulted and informed. They say they don't want to talk to strangers about their families, if that can be avoided, as I just mentioned. And they are happy to talk to a person known to their family. And, of course, that can be a trusted relative or someone both parents are getting on with. Sometimes that's not possible. And I think we need to honour the fact that in the research that I and others do, but I suppose in particular the model I use where I am known to their family, this seems to bring about some really positive relief to the children. And I just want to add something really important here. When I see children, I will not see the children until the parents have achieved one primary task. Not only have they agreed for me to see the child, but I ask each of them to say to the child, "Mum and I, Dad and I are talking to a lady who works with children and separated families, and we, capital W, capital E, want you to go and talk to this lady," or man, or whoever's doing the work. What that does is it's the very first sense the children get of what I've just called aligned parenting. For a long time, they've been dealing with parents who seem divided and unhappy. Suddenly they are hearing their parents say, "We, mum and I, dad and I, want you to go and talk to this lady." And almost 99% of the feedback I've had from parents, because I always ask the same question, "How did your child react when you told them you wanted them to come and see me?" 99% of parents give one or other version of, they didn't really say anything very much at all. or they pulled a face, but then they didn't say anything. And then they will follow it up with, actually, he/she seemed much lighter a bit later in the day. And my strong belief is that children start to feel better when they have a sense that their parents are starting to get back into alignment. Okay, research findings from the parents. Parents say that they became more aware in terms of the feedback from what their children were saying, of the impact of conflict. A father said of his little girl that they had become very aware that when she was at handover in her pushchair, when mummy and daddy came into the same frame, she would put her hands over her face because she was so conditioned to the impact of conflict between them. Parents talked about a renewed motivation to cooperate. Mother of two said, I started to realize that that other person was also the parent. Now, everybody knows that in theory, but emotionally, when things are really tough, there can be a real sense of rejection about this other person being the parent and having the same emotional obligations as well as rights to the same children. A high rate of agreements. So one father said, it was impressive. We started to loosen up. We started to talk about what would actually work instead of arguing about care arrangements, and better communication with the children. We couldn't stop him talking. Parents of one child said after he'd been really bottled up, after he'd had a session, he seemed to feel he had permission to talk. And a father of two talked about the fact that the process of coming together as parents and having the children as part of the process was very healing and constructive. So here's the general research, and we know this from huge numbers of research publications. Children don't want their parents to separate. They don't like the family law system. They report a sense of being manipulated, saying things like everyone had their own agenda. Children complain they only ever had limited and conflicted information. And also children felt that their parents were extremely preoccupied with court stuff, as the children put it. So spend hours on the computer, on the telephone, talking over coffee with friends, always family court, the lawyer said, the affidavit said, and the children just become very conscious that their parents are very, very preoccupied by court, which the children start to dislike intensely, of course. So let's just turn now and have a look at in-court versus out-of-court approaches to the voice of the child and the choice of the child. So bear with me, just a tiny bit sort of dry here, but I think it's an important background. So you will all be aware of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Section 12. Children have the right to comment on matters that affect them. So this principle, to which New Zealand Aotearoa is a signatory, is the principle which family court proceedings and out-of-court processes are predicated on. So then we have COCA, which is the Care of Children Act, which derives from the Section 12 principle in UNCROC, and Section 6 says a child must be given reasonable opportunities to express matters affecting them. So that's when a child becomes a party to the dispute. And as most of you will know, a child will be often in contested proceedings, given their own lawyer to whom the child can express their views. And any view the child expresses directly or through a representative, typically a lawyer for the child, must be taken into account. So this is where we get best interests of the child. So we have to hear their views, and we have to allow there to be a representation of the child's views. All right, now we've got a new law which has been passed, but the details are yet to be established in my area in particular, which is the out-of-court dispute resolution. So bear with me, Section 11 has amended the Family Dispute Resolution Act of 2013. So this new act is called the Family Court Supporting Children in Court Legislation Act, quite a mouthful. Here's what it says. The duties of FDR providers, also known as mediators, are to ensure that children who are subject of a dispute are given any reasonable opportunities to participate in the decisions affecting them that the mediator, FDR provider, considers appropriate. So in other words, mediators now are, very shortly, and the law's here, bound to give children opportunities to participate in the decisions that affect them that the FDR provider considers appropriate. So I'm very interested in the word participate, because I think that's quite different from the child's right to comment. And in my view, participate is the way that I work with children, so that they are actually involved at a child appropriate level in a context in which their parents are also involved but not present at the time of talking to the child. So here we are, voice not a choice, child participation versus the voice of the child. Now this is something that I have got particularly interested in lately, because back in the day when I started my extreme interest in the involvement of children, I called it the voice of the child. I've gone off that now, because I believe there is a significant difference between child participation in the conciliatory problem-solving context versus the expression of child views in the adversarial environment of the court. And this is where I talk about a voice, not a choice, because it worries me. And don't get me wrong, children need to be heard in the court environment, and thank goodness we have got courts, because there are some pretty major issues that get heard in court, and the children need to be able to declare their position. However, children can also be extremely vulnerable to unfair pressure, potential interrogation from one parent or another parent, or perhaps a professional that doesn't really understand the child's position in the rearranging family. And so I will say again and again in every presentation, I'm not talking about situations of violence and abuse. I hope that that's a given in the way that I work, but I am talking about the everyday bread and butter business of how you safely rearrange the family system when there are children involved, and to loving parents who are no longer able to see eye to eye. So the adversarial tends to promote unhealthy and potentially abusive parent-child interactions. So if you're looking at a court case and one parent is arguing with the other parent about who should have the child, or whether one parent shouldn't have the child, or how much contact there should be, or whether that child can be allowed to be taken over to America for the holidays, or which school that child should go to. I mean, you name it. You're then creating a binary, aren't you, where there's a win-lose situation. Nobody wants to lose. So we get a vulnerability of children being coached or feeling pressured to take a position of one parent rather than the other. And this is actually a potentially abusive situation for the parent-child interaction. So again, just bear with me, but I think this is really interesting. Article 12 was clarified in the UN in 2009. So rather than the child has the right to comment on matters affecting them, yes, of course, that's still there. But it was further clarified by the United Nations by saying the child has the right to express those views freely and without pressure. And so the child's own perspective versus adult manipulation and over interviewing was picked as a potential problem. Children should not be manipulated or subjected to undue influence or pressure. I'm sure you all know and agree with this, but to me it's interesting that the UN clarified this UNCROC Article 12. So it's not okay just to say, oh, the voice of the child is absolutely mandatory, and what the child says we've got to listen to. Yes, we do, but it does not mean that that child's voice should become determinative. And we also have to look at what has given motivation to the child's position, remembering children typically don't want separation. They want to love both their parents. And unless we've got something going on in the background, which is abusive to the child, when children come out in a very binary position, I only want this, I want that, I hate him, I hate her, I worry. Just let me say one more time, when we talk about resist, refuse dynamics or alienation, I'm not talking about situations where children are in danger. I'm talking about situations where a child rejects a parent with whom they previously had a loving and safe relationship. So, the European Court of Human Rights challenged the supremacy given to children's views as an ignorance of the need to interpret this notion harmoniously with other fundamental human rights. So to put that simply, let's just say, yes, the child has a right to their view. We're talking about child rights. We're also talking about family rights. And I think there's a danger in a focus of child rights as if family rights don't exist, because when children are not having their family rights carefully considered, then the child at a very tender age, whose views are taken as determinative, well, obviously this child really can't stand being around his mother, and it's probably better that we don't push this, or we have to really look at a modified contact or whatever. Too many examples to go into. What is this going to do to the child's need for a family and the family's need for the child? So I'll say more about this in a minute. I just want to say the European Court of Human Rights, I delved deep into the research and came up with a case called Soares, which was the name of the mother, Soares de Melvo versus Portugal government. So the European Court of Human Rights ruled that a mum who had 9 children and loved those children dearly but was struggling. The children were taken away and there was an appeal made to the court, and that was that the best interests of a child cannot be pursued in a way that completely disregards all the other human rights. So whilst the best interests of the child are a primary consideration, they can't disregard other fundamental human rights, such as the right to respect private family life. So that might be rather a lot to take in, but I do think it's actually quite an important principle, which we can talk about later if you want to. So significant research outputs warn of the danger of court involvement for children. And you know, any medical procedure that was found by scientific measure to be causing harm would be halted immediately. Yes, we need courts in some situations, but when we consider the harm that is done for children in the adversarial process and all the delays and all the witnessing of binary arguments from each parent and arguments between lawyers and children being interviewed over and over, we know that this is not a healthy situation. And as the slide says, if this was a medical procedure that was causing harm, would it not be halted immediately? So it's not an issue of binaries of whether children should express a view. It's not should the child express a view or not. It's yes, give the child a voice, but don't give your child the choice any more than you would allow your child to decide they wanted to start vaping at the age of 11 or stop going to school, or any number of issues that children do not have the psychological or emotional competence to manage. Give children a voice, but not a choice. A heavy burden of responsibility is placed on children who are vulnerable to suggestion and who desire not to disappoint and may well be unable to represent their own best interest. And I think this raises another issue which came up when I was talking to Zane and David, and that's about the issue of enmeshment versus individuality. So it almost feels like I'm talking with forked tongue here. But yes, children need to be individuals and should not speak as part of their mother or part of their father. But it's very difficult for children to be entirely independent in their thought processes when their hearts are breaking because they're struggling between the two parents that they love and worrying about the parent who either seems to have the most power or who seems to be the most vulnerable. Older children have expressed surprise in research at the weight that was put on their views when they were younger. They said, look, I can't believe that everyone took so much notice of what I was saying as a 10-year-old. And they've expressed a sense of manipulation and lasting guilt about the fact that their views were taken as determinative or very, very influential. And interestingly, anecdotal studies indicate that those children who most want to speak to the judge are frequently the children who are most caught up with parental conflict. So I'm probably sticking my neck out here, but I'll do it anyway. But this is what I have noticed. I mean, it's great that judges are happy to talk to children, but I do feel we need to know more about what's going on with the child who says, I want to talk to the judge and tell the judge that this is what I want, and I'm not going to be refused that opportunity. Okay, fine. But why has that child become so vehement, or why does that child feel so strongly that their view needs to be promoted so strongly that they need to go themselves to the judge? And this is where I take some steps back and say, what opportunities was there for that child to have a voice in the somewhat lower key, also powerful but more benign environment of the out-of-court dispute resolution process. All right, how transition can impact different whānau members. Well, I think we all know that the child's in the centre of a spider's web. Grandparents whose hearts can also be broken by parental conflict, who fear desperately that they might lose contact with their child because of hostility, their grandchild, sorry, because of hostility between the parents. Siblings is an interesting one, and I think sometimes we tend to talk about children's voices and children's choices as if the siblings are, you know, one amorphous person. Of course, siblings have completely different positions and views in these situations. And we have to be very, very careful and conscious of what we're doing if we're starting to look at the possibility of separating siblings, whether we interview siblings together, which I don't, by the way. Cousins, terribly important to many, many whānau. Uncles and aunts. So again, I don't need to illustrate this because you all belong to families and understand how significant this is. It's not just the parents and the children. It's the context of the whole family. There's a very interesting book called Children in Separation by Oswuso Bempa. And he talks about something very interesting called sociogenealogical bewilderment. And in really, really intense cases, children can sometimes lose all contact with the other parents, the other parent and the other parent's family. And this plays absolute havoc with the sense of identity that the child has, and that child will go through adulthood continuing to look for answers, which only start to formulate in adolescence and early adulthood. Who am I? I don't have any sense of self. And this sociogenealogical bewilderment has been positively correlated with intense mental health issues. And I know that because I work with a lot of adults who have had the misfortune of being cut off from one part of their family. So the position of the child is a strong and yet delicate spider's web. The developmental agenda of children needs to be right in the very middle of that spider's web. And parents who are in high conflict need to refocus and be supported and facilitated to refocus on their children and to plan for the separation needs of those children. And so my final slide is the one that I use a lot too, because it's so true. There is no legal solution. There is no court order that can compare with one parent recognizing the importance of their child's relationship with the other parent. So that, I think, is the end of my slides. Yes, it is. So,
Thank you, Jill.
okay, thank you, thanks. So maybe